Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this peace is what all true warriors strive for.
25 years ago, on the 10th of October 1993, two games were released for the obscure multimedia device the Philips CDI: Link, The Faces of Evil, and Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon. These games were spin-offs based on the Legend of Zelda series, created as part of a licensing agreement between Nintendo and Philips after the failed attempt to make a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. These games were developed at the same time, on the same engine, by the same people, in order to make up for the minuscule budget and deadline they'd been given. These games languished in obscurity before becoming a viral sensation in the mid to late 2000s for many reasons, but in particular, their bafflingly animated cutscenes. The characters encountered in The Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon were some of the most unusual looking in any game of that era, owing largely to the way they were animated. Abrupt changes in perspective and random zoomings in and out, overly theatrical yet mechanical gestures, and more lines on most of their faces than your average Shakespeare play. It's something that almost defies belief in how bizarre it all is. And if you're someone who associates Zelda with the later games in the series, with a greater focus on storytelling and comparatively subdued presentation, these cutscenes are practically blasphemy. And yet, people still talk about them. On some level, that's because of the legacy they left behind through the equally deranged YouTube poop phenomenon, but they're also just too strange to ever really forget. And when you're faced with something so strange, you kinda wanna find out how it came to be. Maybe for historical curiosity, maybe to make sense of the madness, or maybe just out of sheer boredom. Whatever the reason, you're in luck, my friend. Today, to mark the 25th anniversary of these games, we're going to look at the studio responsible for their creation, Animation Magic Incorporated. Production. Dale DeSharon, formerly DeSharoon, was a school teacher who got into game development in the early 80s, working with studios such as Atari and Commodore. His most famous project at the time was an adventure game based on the fantasy novel Below the Root. In 1987, he joined Spinnaker Software, a studio known for creating educational games, and one that had just struck a deal with Philips to produce games for their then recently announced CDI system. DeSharon became a manager of the development team, who spent the next few years creating 7 launch titles for the CDI. He hadn't planned on staying around for that long, but the CDI had gotten stuck in development hell. It was announced in 1986 to be released in 1988, but got repeatedly pushed back until 1991. After Spinnaker produced the initial 7 games, it was clear they didn't have interest in making more. As a result, DeSharon left the studio to re-establish an old firm of his, Dale DeSharon Incorporated, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was joined by a substantial chunk of the team he'd managed at Spinnaker. DeSharon Inc. were able to get development funding from American Interactive Media, the software publishing branch for the CDI. It was around this time that they were granted the license by Nintendo to use 5 of their characters in games made for the CDI. These characters came from Mario, which despite multiple projects only saw one released game in the infamous Hotel Mario, as well as the Legend of Zelda games. DeSharon's team managed to pitch 2 separate games, one where you played as Link, and another where you played as Zelda. However, complications arose when the publisher gave them pitifully small development budgets of around $600,000 per game. Not only was this bus fare compared to even educational titles for the same system, which typically got budgets in the millions, but there were also employment costs to consider. To support just one technical engineer for a year, including salary, taxes, insurance, and the like, cost around $100,000, never mind the rest of the team. This led to a couple of key decisions. The first was to develop both games at the same time, using the same engine and assets in order to save time and resources. They would be developed within a year to utilize the small budgets efficiently. The second decision came as a result of a desire expressed by the publisher to see full-motion video animation in the games, which was seen as quite the selling point in an era when CD-ROM gaming was starting to become a thing. DeSharon didn't know how he was going to include animated cutscenes while keeping it within budget, but that was when a friend introduced him to a man who would change everything: Igor Razbov. Igor Razbov had been living in the US for 12 years, working at technical companies such as Bell Labs and Computer Vision. He was interested in starting up a company himself, but he wanted to do it in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he had previously earned a PhD in higher mathematics and computer science. This was shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Razbov wanted to build a company that could provide some kind of service to American businesses. For Disharoon Inc., that service would be to create animated cutscenes. Desharon had seen many animated films produced by the Eastern Bloc, and felt that Russian animators would be more than able to do the job, and at a cheaper price. Razbov agreed, and the two founded the subsidiary that the entire company would eventually be named after, Animation Magic Incorporated. However, finding animators was more difficult than initially anticipated. Russian animation was primarily made in Moscow, with the government-funded Soyuz Multfilm Studio being its most prolific producer of animation in the country. But Animation Magic was set up in St. Petersburg, which was just over 700 kilometers away from Moscow. A bit too far for a daily commute, wouldn't you say? According to Desharon, Razbov eventually found about 6 or 7 animators of varying quality, who were then brought over to the US for 6 months as they worked on the animation for the games. The animators drew their scenes on paper before scanning them onto the computers they were provided, where each drawing was then digitally inked and colored. And yes, that means the animation you're seeing in these games is in fact digital animation. I know that sounds like a diss at first, but it's really not. Digital inking and coloring was slowly becoming more prevalent at this point in time, particularly with CD-ROM games, so it only makes sense that the studio saw fit to do the same. Heck, it even explains some of the coloring errors and iffy line quality, since people were still trying to figure this stuff out and were bound to make mistakes. This might especially be the case when the game's credits only list the animators, which possibly means that they had to ink and color in everything themselves, a job that's usually delegated to qualified staff because, well, it's one thing to animate something, but another thing altogether to ink and color it. After the 6-month stay, the animators returned to St. Petersburg and began recruiting and training more staff. This likely involved animators in particular, since the final credits for both games feature way more than 6 or 7 animators. It might be shocking at first to think that Nintendo would approve of the animation seen on display, but that's because they didn't have all that much input. The only things that Animation Magic had to run by Nintendo were the design document and character sketches for Link and Zelda. If that sounds crazy, it's worth remembering a couple of things about the time. Firstly, this was when Nintendo was much more laissez-faire about what external studios did with their franchises. Remember, this was when the company thought stuff like Mario is Missing, Captain N, or the live-action Mario movie were okay, before they became a lot more protective of their characters and IPs. It's not surprising that they wouldn't have batted much of an eye at these games during that time. Plus, Animation Magic only had the first 2 games to work with at that point, which were pretty light on detailing the nature of the world and characters beyond the vaguest ideas and whatever was in the manuals, so they pretty much had to make stuff up, which only becomes noticeable when taken alongside the rest of the series. But how do they hold up on their own? Well, let's get the obvious out of the way. The quality is inconsistent, ranging from pretty decent to hysterically amateurish. The abrupt cuts between angles are baffling and lacking in rhyme or reason. Same goes for the sudden zoomings in and out and inexplicable rotations. And those gestures, my god, Gandalf from the animated Lord of the Rings film is nothing on these guys in terms of sheer pantomime. And yet, I kinda can't help but admire them on some level. As ridiculous as those zooms and rotations are, some of them are pulled off impressively well considering how hard it is to animate changes in perspective. Some scenes, like the Ice Queen telling Link where to go through the mirror, find unique ways of conveying otherwise standard information. There's even little attempts to give the characters more humor or personality, such as the Mayor of Sakato's itchy nose, or this evil wizard's very smeary, cool way of transporting across the screen. Considering the production circumstances, I'd say these turned out pretty alright. If nothing else, they're unforgettably hilarious, and part of that comes down to the script and voice acting. The endlessly quotable dialogue was handled by Jonathan Merritt, a freelance writer who had previously worked on Spinnaker's educational games. Meanwhile, the voice cast was sourced from local actors working for the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists Union, who now form the TV and radio division of SAG-AFTRA. Among these actors are Jeremy Rath as Link, Bonnie Jean Wilbur as Zelda, and a whole host of actors who, while credited, weren't attributed to any specific characters. Despite the reputation these games garnered in later years, they actually got pretty good reviews at the time. In fact, the animated cutscenes, along with the game's overall production values, were praised for being of particularly high quality. When it comes to presentation, the only part of it that's still well liked is the surprisingly good soundtrack composed by Anthony "Tony" Trippi, who continued to provide music for Animation Magic over the years. It's hard to get sales numbers, with one source saying they sold respectably and another claiming they sold as poorly as most CDI games. But whatever the case, I presume the games turned something of a profit and development went smoothly enough since Animation Magic continued to keep producing games for the next decade. They made a lot of games, and considering how hard it is to find knowledge on most of them, I'm not going to try and cover every one. Instead, I'll just look at the ones that I find personally interesting and might be worth checking into yourself. And let's start by briefly discussing a game they did not make: Hotel Mario. People often think that Animation Magic was responsible for this game too, since it's another reviled Nintendo spin-off with infamous animated cutscenes, but they had nothing to do with it. The developer behind this game was Philips Fantasy Factory, a short-lived team that doesn't seem to have done much else. Hell, it wasn't even animated by Russians if the credits are anything to go by. However, Animation Magic did make another game for the CDI, and it's something. Mutant Rampage Body Slam was a side-scrolling beat-em-up released in 1994. Yes, you heard that right, a beat-em-up for the Philips CDI, and while it looks a bit jerky and it's actually kind of impressive, especially considering the system didn't have anywhere near the kind of horsepower to make games you'd see on the Mega Drive or Super Nintendo. Its central premise is as generic as a game set in the distant future can be. Everything's gone to heck, people watch gruesome game shows online, and oh no, furries! You take control of one of 3 pure-blooded humans in a group called the Naturals, and take on a selection of deranged mutants and cyborgs to win the ultimate game show, Body Slam! Like the Zelda games, Mutant Rampage features about 10 to 12 minutes worth of animated cutscenes, which largely comprise of pre- and post-level discussions between the game show's endlessly quotable announcer, Air J Wolfjam, and whatever boss you're gonna face at the end of the level. The animation quality is more consistent than before, with some cuts even looking surprisingly good. Of course, you've still got those hilarious zooms and ridiculous gestures to enjoy, which are backed up by some charmingly goofy voice acting. Sadly, a good chunk of the animation consists of recycled shots of Wolfjam and the game's big bad Hectro-Genocide with different dialogue dubbed over, so there sadly isn't as much gloriously silly animation to talk about as before. In terms of production, the St. Petersburg side of Animation Magic had more involvement than before. While most of the work was still handled in the States, the Russian staff not only handled the cutscenes again, but were also responsible for the character designs, in-game sprites, and background art. This likely came as a result of the game beginning development after this side of the studio had been founded, meaning that more work could be divided up between the 2 divisions. In regards to the American staff, most of the same team that developed the Zelda games are here, and that includes the narrative staff. Jonathan Merritt's back writing the dialogue, which is delivered by most of the same after actors from last time. Wait, Adam Blaustein? Where do I know that name? Huh. Who'd have thunk it? It's hard to find info on Mutant Rampage, along with most CDI games that aren't associated with Nintendo, so I can't say how well the game reviewed or sold. But it was the last game Animation Magic made for the CDI, owing to the system's continuing lack of popularity, especially in the face of the upcoming generation of consoles. Having been bought by Capital Multimedia, they migrated to the PC, which had a much larger audience that could make their games profitable. Throughout the rest of the 90s, Animation Magic spent the next few years developing numerous games for clients such as Fisher-Price and Simon & Schuster. Most of these were edutainment games, which tapped into the American side's experience from their time at Spinnaker, and when it comes to Animation Magic and edutainment, where else can we start except... the Magic Labyrinth of